Yeah, my name is Michael Reynolds. Thank you to everyone who is joining us for this singular event with Peter Cameron and Damon Galgut. I'm glad you could make it. My name is Michael Reynolds, and I am the editor-in-chief of Europa Editions. And I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes introducing our guests, our speakers today. Peter Cameron, for those of you who don't know, is the author of 7 novels and 3 collections of stories. His fiction has appeared pretty much everywhere you would want short fiction to appear: the New Yorker, the Paris Review, Rolling Stone, etc., etc. Many other literary journals. And his most recent book, The Wonderful What Happens at Night, which Garth Greenwell described as faultlessly elegant and quietly menacing. It was published in the US by our friends at Catapult, and in the UK by our colleagues at Europa UK, and I'm sure available in both countries at bookshop.org, as well as bookstores everywhere. Peter, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. Damon Galgut is the author of 8 novels, including The Good Doctor and In a Strange Room, which were both shortlisted for the Booker Prize. In a Strange Room and his subsequent novel, Arctic Summer, and this latest novel, The Promise, which I have here, were all published by Europa Editions. And well, I just have to add that there are few writers, if any, that we are prouder to publish at Europa than Damon, who's just simply one of the finest stylists and most important storytellers working today. I'll remind those of you listening before we move on to our conversation that of The Promise, Edmund White wrote, "It is the most important book of the last 10 years." And Claire Massoud opened her review of The Promise by reminding us that a surprising number of novelists are very good, few are extraordinary, going on to argue that Damon, of course, is one of those extraordinary few. This is very high praise from very smart readers, and it doesn't stop there. The Promise has been reviewed widely, and to say well would be a definite understatement. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Again, thank you, Damon. Thank you, Peter, for joining us, and thank you to all of you who are tuning in on Zoom to listen to this conversation. Just one quick reminder, in order to facilitate today's conversation, audience members will be muted to make sure that there's no interfering noise, but that certainly doesn't mean that you are silenced. Please add any questions or comments that you may have in the window, and either our speakers will address them directly, or I'll bring those questions to them later in the event. On that note, I will turn it over to you, Peter, and you, Damon. And if I'm not mistaken, I think we're going to begin with a reading.
Michael, yes, so we just decided it would probably be best to start with a reading from The Promise, which Damon has offered to do, because that will put our conversation then in a bit of a context. So Damon, do you want to go ahead and read?
Sure. Thanks very much, Michael, for that generous introduction. It's really odd doing a reading in front of my computer, but I should be getting used to it by now. I'll try to pretend there's a vast audience out there. I don't know how much scene setting I have to do for the reading, but I'll just say that it takes place early in the book, and it concerns mostly a young girl, Amor Swart, who has run away from her family home and is sitting on a kopje, which in South African speak is a small hill looking down on the house. There are a few sort of South African terms in the reading. I hope the sense will come through even if they're unfamiliar. again, please excuse the odd nature of a live, unlive reading, not how it usually is. Amor can see the two of them, her uncle and the doubting dominee, through the sliding glass doors of the lounge. From the top of the kopje, she can see the whole front of the house, all the windows on display, which is why she likes to sit here, although she's not supposed to do it alone. It's never been so busy down there on the ground floor, multiple human figures moving around like toy people in a toy building. But her attention is not on them. She's looking at only one window, upstairs, third from the left, thinking, she's in there. If I just go down the hill and up the stairs, she'll be in her room waiting for me, like always. And she can see somebody moving around in there, a female figure bustling about. If she half closes her eyes, Amor can imagine that it really is her mother, her body strong and healthy again, cleaning up the medicine from next to her bed. Not needed anymore. Ma is better again, time has been turned back, the world is restored. Easy as that. But she knows she's just pretending, and the person in the room isn't Ma. It's Salome, of course, who has been here on the farm forever, or that's how it feels. My grandfather always talked about her like that. Oh, Salome, I got her along with the land. Pause a moment to observe as she takes the sheets off the bed. A stout, solid woman wearing a second-hand dress given to her by Ma years ago. A headscarf tied over her hair. She's barefoot, and the soles of her feet are cracked and dirty. Her hands have marks on them too, the scuffs and scars of innumerable collisions. Same age as Ma, supposedly, 40, though she looks older. Hard to put an exact number on her. Not much shows in her face. She wears her life like a mask, like a graven image. But some things you do know because you saw them yourself. In the same impassive way that Salome sweeps and cleans the house and washes the clothes of the people who live in it, she looked after Ma through her last illness, dressing and undressing her, helping her to bathe with a bucket of hot water and a lappy, helping her to go to the toilet, yes, even wiping her ass for her after she used the bedpan, mopping up blood and shit and pus and piss, all the jobs that people in her own family didn't want to do, too dirty or too intimate. Let Salome do it. That's what she's paid for, isn't it? She was with Ma when she died, right there next to the bed. Though nobody seems to see her, she is apparently invisible. And whatever Salome feels is invisible too. She has been told, clean up here, wash the sheets, and she obeys. She cleans up, she washes the sheets. But Amor can see her through the window, so she's not invisible after all. Thinking about a memory, not understood till now, of an afternoon just 2 weeks ago in that same room with Ma and Pa. They forgot I was there in the corner. They didn't see me. I was like a black woman to them. Do you promise me, Marnie? Holding on to him, skeleton hands grabbing like in a horror film. Yeah, I'll do it. Because I really want her to have something after everything she's done. I understand, he says. Promise me you'll do it. Say the words. I promise, Pa says, choked sounding. She sees the picture still. Her parents tangled together like Jesus and his mother, a terrible sad knot of clutching and crying. The sound somewhere else, higher up and apart, the words not reaching her till now. But finally, she understands who they were talking about. Of course, obviously, duh. She's sitting in the spot she likes, between the rocks at the bottom of the burnt tree, where I was when the lightning struck, where I nearly died. Pow! White fire dropping out of the sky. As if God pointed at you, Pa says. But how would he know? He wasn't here when it happened. The wrath of the Lord is like an avenging flame. But I didn't burn, not like the tree, except for my feet. In hospital, 2 months, recovering. There is still tenderness in the soles, and one small toe is missing. She touches it now, fingering the scar. One day, she says aloud, one day I'll, but the thought breaks off midway, and what she'll do one day hangs there, suspended. What's happening now is that somebody else is climbing the hill from the other side, a human figure approaching, filling itself in slowly, putting on age and sex and race like items of clothing, till she's looking at a black boy, also 13 years old, wearing ragged shorts and t-shirt, broken tackies on his feet. Sweat sticks cloth on skin. Pull it loose with your fingers. Hello, Lucas, she says. How's it, amor? First, it is necessary to beat the earth with a stick. Then he settles himself on a rock. Easy to speak to each other. Not the first time they've met up here. Children still, on the verge of not being children anymore. I'm sorry about your mommy, he says. She nearly cries again, but doesn't. It's all right when he says it, because Lucas's father died too on a gold mine near Johannesburg when he was only little. Something joins them together. What she just remembered spills over. She wants to tell him about it. It's yours now, the house, she says. He looks at her, not understanding. My mother told my father to give it to your mother. A Christian never goes back on his word. He looks down the hill to the other side where he lives in the crooked little house, the Lombard place. That's what everyone calls it, even though old Mrs. Lombard died years ago, before Amor's grandfather bought it to stop that Indian family moving in and let Salome live there instead. Some names stick, some don't. Our house. It'll be yours now. He blinks, still confused. It's always been his house. He was born there. He sleeps there. What is the white girl talking about? Growing bored, he spits and stands up. She notices how long and strong his legs have become, the wiry hairs growing on his thighs. She can smell him too, the stink of sweat. All this is new, or maybe the noticing is new, and she's embarrassed already, even before she's aware he's looking at her. What? She says, huddling over, arms on her knees. Nothing. He jumps over to her rock, crouches down next to her. His bare leg is close to hers. She can feel the warmth and prickle. She jerks her knee away. She says, you need to wash. He gets up quickly and leaps back to the other rock. Now she feels sorry for chasing him away, but doesn't know what to say. He picks up his stick and hits with it again. All right, he says. Okay. He walks back down the hill the same way he came up, slashing with a stick at the white tops of the grass, pushing it into termite hills, letting the world know he's there. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Damon Thomas. I agree with Claire Massoud about you being such an exceptional writer. And I think one of the things to me that makes your work so exceptional is that all your books are brilliant and beautiful, but they're all brilliant and beautiful in very different ways. And I think many writers can do one thing, you know, over and over again, but you seem with each book to be doing something new and sort of finding a form for the story you want to tell that's very unique to the book itself. So I wanted to start out just by asking you sort of about the genesis for this book. And in some ways, this book seems, well, it can seem like a conventional, very like a family saga, you know, and in some ways it can seem, I wonder, I think when you have a character like Anton, who's Amor's brother, who's a would-be novelist, I think when we encounter a character, like we think, oh, is this an alter ego for the author? So I wondered, are you in this book in some ways? And just sort of how you came to write this book now.
Thanks, Peter. A big part of every book, I mean, in many ways, what I find the most difficult aspect is trying to find the voice for it. And I don't just mean the usual, is this, you know, first person or third person, although that is part of it. It's more like, what is the voice that belongs to this particular book? Not just the narrator, but how does this book want to speak? You know, and in order to answer that, you kind of have to know where the book's coming from and what it is you're trying to do. I'll be honest with you, when I finished my previous book, Arctic Summer, it didn't feel to me as if I had another book in me. I mean, it's not a new feeling, and I guess a lot of novelists may feel that way, but it took a while to kind of dig into myself and find what it was I wanted to say next. Which is to say, I need to kind of figure out what my central preoccupation is. And I've reached the point in middle age, even later middle age, where my central preoccupation right now is time and the passage of time. So I guess I was looking, partly unconsciously, for a story that might work as a vehicle for that concern. And once you've got that sort of burning, you know, a lot of ideas might take root. And the one in this particular case that did strike came from an anecdote that a friend told me. It was just a casual conversation, but he's a friend who's a decade or so older than me. And he was telling me, he happens to be the last surviving member of his family. He's lost both parents, his brother, his sister. He's the last person left. And he was telling me on a sort of semi-drunken afternoon, a series of stories from the 4 family funerals he's attended. And a number of things struck me in that. Firstly, that funerals could be funny because they're not about the dead person, they're actually about the relations that attend. And secondly, that the same people tend to crop up. I mean, maybe a little bit older, maybe the situation is different, but that, you know, you're seeing with a family funeral, the family essentially sort of moving along. And it sort of struck me that, you know, it would be an interesting way to tell the story of a family just through the snapshot of 4 funerals. And you wouldn't get the sort of intervening time, you would just get that period of time. And you would have to kind of fill in the blanks yourself. So I became really intrigued by that idea. And that was really the genesis of it. You know, to pick up with the second part of your question, is there anything of me in there? Well, of course. I mean, you can't write a book unless you're going to be drawing on yourself. It's not only Anton, though, that I'm drawing on, although he may be more vivid in a turbulent sort of way than some of the other characters, and that's definitely a sign that, you know, I feel myself or my colors sort of running in him. But all of these characters, one way or another, would not have life if they didn't represent some aspect of my own nature, which, you know, is not unusual for a novelist. It helps to have several personalities that you can sort of set at odds with each other in the telling of a story.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about is it Amor? How do you say her name? Pronounce her name?
Well, in a South African way, you would say Amor. And while I'm on that, by the way, I'm aware in the reading that the name Salome, in its classical pronunciation, would be Salome, but in South Africa that would not be the case. Everything tends to get flat. Okay. So.
Well, I'm so intrigued by her as a character because well, I feel there's this tension with her as a character because she is, I guess, because she feels like she's the moral center of the book, certainly, and she's the best character in the book in terms of, I would say, in terms of just the quality of her personhood. But she's also, in some ways, the most absent person from the book. I feel like she's always, she's the one who's always leaving. And we do get close to her at moments throughout the book, but we don't spend, you know, amounts of time with her in the way we do with Astrid and Anton, where we really get to see them in their lives. And I wondered how you feel about her as a character, or did you do that? And at one point you mentioned that she feels that she exists as a sort of blur on the edges of the vision of her siblings, of her family. And I just feel like there's a really interesting way that she's placed in the book, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I see Amor and her older brother Anton as the two antagonists, protagonists, however you
Right.
to think of it. And I've sort of structured the book around them. So, you know, each section begins with one of them and ends with the other, and then picks up with that same character and then ends with the other, and so on. Not something you'd necessarily consciously register if you were reading. So I, you know, but in that structure, I was trying to set her against Anton. Whatever he represents, she represents the other pole, as it were. I mean, I don't know how clear it was from the reading that I did, but Amor as a young child has been struck by lightning in an accident. And everyone around her, one way or another, thinks she's a bit odd, maybe in the same way that you've sort of picked up on, that there's something opaque about her, something that doesn't quite come into focus. And you know, some characters even think that she's sort of, you know, mentally defective, or she has a problem as a result. It's also said about her that she's a listener, in the sense that she pays attention in a way that makes you want to tell her things. So there is a kind of a, I don't know what the word is, a blankness or an inscrutability about her that doesn't ever quite get filled in. That is deliberate. I mean, I could have invented details for Amor that would have sort of made her clearer. But as you say, she is the moral center of the book. All the other characters are, sometimes to a quite appalling degree, really morally reprehensible, or they, you know, really are not very admirable. Let's put it that way. Whereas she, even if it's only in a small way, and at the very end of the novel, sort of comes to be the only moral person, or the only person who's prepared to kind of stick to a moral act. So, you know, in a certain sense, her mysteriousness remains a mystery to me too. There's something about her I wanted to leave just a little bit out of reach. I mean, we know some things about her in an exterior sort of way, but I think all kind of goodness that's good for its own sake is always a little bit mysterious, you know?
Well, I wonder, it's interesting you say that, because I wonder, and I realize this might sound like a silly question, but I really don't mean it that way at all. But I ended up feeling that perhaps she is a saint. And I wonder what you think about that, because in this book we have ghosts, and they're dealt with very matter-of-factly. They're there in the book. They're felt and they're seen. And just going back to what you were saying about her more, that people think she's a little simple, or that she was, you know, she was struck by lightning, which is an act of God. We think of as an act of God, and then they think she's deficient in some way. But then throughout the book, everybody is touched by her kindness, and they realize essentially she's a very kind person, and everything she does is sort of motivated by that sense of kindness. And then at one point towards the very end of the book, Bob, the homeless guy who actually sees sort of parasitic entities encrusted on people, sees her and sees that she is sort of free and clear, and in fact she actually gives off a sort of glow. And so I just wonder, and in some ways I feel like that might explain her mysteriousness, that she is, she's special, I think. And
yeah, no, I think you put your finger on it. I mean, I was trying to play with that idea of saintliness, because there's something sort of mysterious about it. I was having an online conversation with somebody the other night who said that Amor seems to be the only self-aware character in the book. And actually I take issue with that. Mm-hmm. I think in a certain way, Anton is more self-aware than she is. There's something about her that might be damaged. I mean, she's, you know, this promise has been made to the black lady, Salome, who works for the family. And a lot of politics kind of builds up around that promise. But for her, it's not political. It was a promise. And if you made a promise, you keep the promise. So she doggedly locks onto that. Now you can see that as saintly, as good, or you could see it as a bit simple-minded, if you like, because I mean, Anton makes an offer at some point in the book. We'll do a trade. If you give me what I want, he has this kind of elaborate machination that he's dreaming up around the property. If you give me what I want, I'll give you what you want. And she says, no, this was promised. We stick with the promise. So yeah, I don't want to tell you what it means, because partly because I may not know, but also partly because I want it to remain a little bit mysterious. But yeah, I do think there's something a little bit inexplicable about people in the world who want to do good simply because that's their impulse. I mean, most of us operate out of self-interest, or the interests of our group, whatever that may be. But for people who believe there's something right, there's something wrong, and you should try to do the right thing, it's a little bit mysterious, because it's often against your own interests. There's often nothing in it for you. So why? Because the world doesn't work that way. So there's something about more that's almost apart from everyone else, apart from the book itself, in a way.
Well, in fact, as Susan, her partner, her observes, her work as a nurse in an AIDS ward is actually, Susan perceives it as being detrimental to Amor, that it's sort of that it's weighing too heavily on her, and sort of and yet Amor cannot imagine doing any other kind of work, I feel. You know, at the end she's working again with dying people. So there is a I
mean, she goes actually even a little further, in the sense that by the end of the book, she's not with Susan anymore, or with the the male partners she's had. She's entirely on her own, and there's I'm probably going to misquote my own book, but something to the effect that the only people she touches are people in need.
Yes,
she's not touching anybody with the touch of intimacy any longer. Her intimacy is caring for others. So her most powerful inner impulses are to do with looking after others and trying to repair damage, which is a rare quality indeed, and I may add, very rare in this country.
That's right. I wanted to also talk a bit about, this book has many characters in it. There are the three children, the two parents. There's the aunt and her husband, and then there's the various spouses of Astrid and Anton. But there's also these two characters, Salome and Lucas, her son, who live in a little house that is sort of the that they don't own, but that the mother has asked the father to promise to deed over to Salome at the very beginning of the book, and then 40 years later, it takes 40 years for that to actually happen. But what I'm interested in sort of is, and it's going back in a way to your point of view throughout this book, is you're so fluid in terms of moving from first person to third person to second person. You sort of avail yourself of any point of view, any perspective that can, I guess, do what you want to do in that particular moment. Yet there's this, the characters that remain, I think, the most distant from that narrative point of view are Salome and Lucas. And at one point you say about Salome that everything she does is invisible, or her feelings are invisible. We can see her, but her feelings are invisible. And about Lucas, you say later that we don't know him well enough to ask about how he's been formed, in a way. And I wonder, was that political? Why did you feel this distance from those characters, where in other places, you're very free with crossing boundaries of gender and things like that? In fact, I think it's pretty amazing that there's a scene in the beginning of the book where you describe Amor's first period, which is a place where, as a male writer, I was sort of told you can't go there, and yet you do, and you do it brilliantly. And so it's not a question of courage, I feel like, because you've shown that you're willing to go just about anywhere.
I mean, I could answer this at great length, but I'll try and be succinct about it. I started the book in a more conventional way. I mean, I knew it was going to be a third-person narrative with a lot of characters. But I was very frustrated with the way it was going, and after I'd embarked on it and worked on it a little, I was offered fortuitously the chance to work on a film script. So I did a couple of drafts of this script before I opted out. It took a few months, and it served its purpose, but it served its purpose especially well in that when I returned to this novel, something of the logic of a film script carried over. And I suddenly saw that you could make a narrative behave in the same way that a camera behaves cinematically, that you could move from character to character. Language is more powerful than cinema in the sense that you can go inside a character, and that you could leap from one psyche to another, sometimes in the middle of one sentence, that physically you could move from one location to another if you could find a sort of lateral logic for that leap. So I suddenly felt a great freedom in how I could play with that voice. So that sort of explains why I suddenly felt bold enough to romp around between a whole bunch of characters, which I'd actually never done before. Mm-hmm. But I also had to kind of balance that freedom with the constraints of what I was doing. And what I was doing was writing about white South Africans, a group of white South Africans. And I was trying to put on display, in as much as my powers would allow me, the white psyche, if an entity like that actually exists, the white South African psyche. So I made a decision that I would only look at the Black characters who intersect with this white family as far as their perceptions would go, which is to say not very far. So you're only getting as much about Salome and her son Lucas, or the other passing Black characters, as you would get if you were one of the white characters in the story who noticed them or looked. So the absence of information about those characters is meant to register. It's meant to say something by saying very little, if that makes sense. So that was the logic of that decision.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How does Bob then fit into that equation? Because I find him fascinating too as a character. You're doing something very different with him.
Yeah, I mean, Bob's race is never specified, so
okay.
you could assume he's, there are a lot of homeless white people in South Africa right now.
Right,
there have been for a while, but more and more.
Mm-hmm.
He could be any one of those people, but of course he could be a Black character or a mixed race person or whatever it may be. It's not said. Right. So I mean, I sort of see Bob as I don't know. He comes from a slightly, he's obviously there and present, but he's attuned to his own reality, which is not the same as anyone else's. So the rules that apply to Bob are somewhat, separate.
Yes. Yeah. No, I can see that, and that's what's intriguing. Mm-hmm.
Which is the case, you mentioned seeing ghosts and so on. So I sort of thought, well, if you're going to have this freedom to move from, the central characters in the book, why not let the range drift a little bit further? I mean, outside the realm of the living, even just casually talk about ghosts, or go into the psyche of a perhaps mentally disturbed person and look at the world the way they see it, because those are realities too. If you can imagine them in a literary sense, they're true. So that was sort of the rule I was trying to follow.
Well, right. This book seems to have a very porous conscience. It's and at times it's very clearly omniscient, when in terms of knowing what people are thinking. But at times it seems it goes beyond that, because it's there's a case of the jackals where we follow them off, and so we're in an animal consciousness sort of. But I guess I feel like the air of this book, the atmosphere of this book is different from any other book I've read, in that it doesn't follow the regular rules, I think, of how we expect things to be observed and recorded. And I guess I have a question about that sort of phenomena too, because in the scene you were just reading, it concludes with this sort of list of data about the items consumed at the wake, where people have gathered back at the house, and it tells us how many cups of tea were drunk and how many times the toilet was flushed, and this list of really exact, very exact details. And then at another point in the book, you mentioned things like an unmeasurable amount of time has passed. And I think it's really interesting where at one point you can tell us exactly how many times, the toilet was flushed. And then at other times, time passes in this way, or things happen that can't be exactly recorded. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit about that? How you see in fiction, how you tell the truth in fiction, sort of, or how you get at the truth, and when you can and when you can't.
Yeah, my answer is probably going to be a little bit fuzzy because this is sort of the kind of outer limit of the rules, really. And I'll be straightforward and tell you that it was a constant gnawing worry through the writing of this book that it might not be working, because I knew I was breaking all the rules. And I would never allow a writing student that I was supervising.
Exactly, right.
Right. So I don't know, I decided to just let rip and take the consequences later. The logic that I followed was that even a third person narration where you're allowed to be omniscient, it's a story being told by somebody. You may imagine the somebody as me, or you may imagine it as a sort of projected omniscient narrator with no clear name or persona, but still there is a voice telling the story. So what I started doing was just playing with that voice and trying to draw attention to the fact that this is a voice with its own consciousness. So there were moments when the voice would sort of comment on something it had just said, like there's a point where it talks about lights behind and in front of the house being fore and aft, and then it says, note the nautical terms, for example. But there are a lot of those little asides, little slips of the tongue, or Freudian slips, or whatever you want to call it, that just draw attention to the fact that this is the voice of somebody speaking. And the somebody at times almost becomes a something, because there are moments when the voice swings around and addresses the reader directly and says, this character is ashamed of her body, as many of you are. So is this a person with a body speaking or not? What was more important to me in those things than identifying who this persona is, was to raise the question of, like, can you fix such a thing? Because books sort of come from a lot of different angles and so on. So I was in a sense trying to come from every conceivable angle, in the same way that I sort of try to stretch the voice into jackals and ghosts and what an arbitrary side character might be thinking. I also wanted to stretch the narration sometimes into first person. If you come very close to a character, it would sort of fall into a first person voice. Right. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes very, very far from the character, so that it becomes almost cold. In the passage that you've just mentioned, where there's a lot of mathematical information, that's sort of about as cold as that voice gets, right? So some people have said to me they found the voice at moments quite cruel. And I guess that coldness and cruelty go together. But I sort of felt I'd balanced it out by coming so close sometimes that you identify so closely with the character that you lapse into first person. So I guess the short answer amongst this fuzziness is that I was trying to make this voice speak out of as many different corners and angles as I possibly could and make it work.
Right. which is fascinating. And I think you succeed brilliantly in a really original way. Finally, I just want to ask you, Claire Mercer was not the only distinguished writer to review this book glowingly. James Wood, in his review in the New Yorker, also just, raves about it. And it was interesting to me because that review talked more about a book technically than most book reviews do. And I think it is this fascination with how you tell this story and how complicated it seems, but also how well it works and how appropriate it is. And he also mentions in his review something about the allegorical pressure of being a writer from South Africa and writing about South Africa. And of course, this is very much a domestic, a very personal story about a singular family, but it does pay attention to the politics of the times throughout the 4 different sections. And of course, it's set over this period where things are really changing in South Africa. And I guess my question would be, do you feel that allegorical pressure yourself as a writer? And do you find it as, is it a burden or is it a boon in a way to feel like that you can take your personal experience and make it larger, make it speak to larger issues?
Yeah, I think the way James Wood sort of framed it was that, this, like a lot of South African stories, it can't just be a story about a farm. It's got to be, the farm has to stand in for the whole country in some way. And that is a great weight in South African writing, that somehow, no matter how small your story, it has to carry the weight of history. You're answering for this country and things that have happened in it. So, that's a kind of a burden in one way. In another way, I have to say, there are great themes here. South Africa is still working stuff out that, maybe elsewhere in the world, the historical processes have already digested and moved on, but we're still working in a kind of primal way with very, very important questions, very painful on a human level, but on a literary level, a kind of a gift. I mean, there's a sort of inbuilt power to these questions. So if you measure up to them and you try to give them some scope and grandeur, you've got a big book or a strong book.
Right.
Whereas, for perhaps more sedate countries or countries where history has become a little tamer, the themes are also a little tamer. And maybe that's a relief. I'm not someone who feels free to write in that way. Just to pick up on something you mentioned about the stages of history, as it were, that the sections of the book represent. Once I realized or formulated for myself that time is the sort of submerged theme of the book, I tried to look for ways to convey that. And one of the ways that was fun was to pick up on stuff that had changed from one section to another. So each section takes place in a different decade. Each section also takes place in a different season, although it's not significant. And I'm looking, although I hope it's not too obvious, at how people's faces change, people's lives change, how politics changes, how the laws that we make, the laws that govern this country have changed dramatically. Yeah, the passage of time sort of speaks through change. And, the biggest and most obvious change that we all feel is the change in our own lives, our own bodies, which is why Amor, as you said, in the first section, it's her first menstruation, which was not a straightforward subject for a man to tackle, let me just say in passing. But the final section, we sort of reached the point where she's got to menopause and what that means. I could have written about a man. I know how male bodies change, but I thought it would be, again, a stretch for me to try and imagine it through a woman's body and a woman's life. I mean, I don't know how vividly I've managed to do that, but I've had some very interesting conversations with my female friends, and various windows have opened on the world for me through that.
I see Michael has rejoined us. I'm wondering if there are questions people watching have.
There are a few, if I can sneak them in. First of all, I really want to thank both of you for that conversation. It was fascinating. I think we've all become Zoom fatigued, and I will note that we're ending this hour with exactly the same number of audience members as we started the hour. So nobody became fatigued on this this particular Zoom event. Just a couple of questions. A couple for Damon, then a couple, I think, for both of you. First of which, Damon Galgut, thank you very much for your work, Mr. Galgut. Other contemporary South African writers whose work you admire, recommend, that you think gives similar insight into, I suppose, the political historical situation in South Africa at the moment?
I should confess that I'm really woefully underread in South African literature, but so are most people, just because there actually is quite a lot of it. Most of it is just published locally, never finds its way anywhere else, but there's quite an exciting publishing scene on a small scale here. I'm going to sidestep the question, because if I single out very particular people, there are other people who are going to feel overlooked. But the South African writers that have become world famous have become that way mostly for a reason. So I would, really recommend Coetzee, Gordimer, Zakes Madar is a name you hear more and more. Somebody who's overlooked a great deal, but I find really interesting, Tatamkhulu Africa. I'm not sure if his work is available over there. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that, because I suspect I may be treading on a few toes. The scene is lively, and there's a lot to discover for anyone who's really interested.
Thank you. And here I'm going to transform a comment into a question for purely selfish reasons. I would like to hear a little bit more about this, but earlier in your conversation, when you were talking about the perspective on that that your white characters have on black characters, you mentioned focalization as opposed to point of view. And one of our audience members comments, I love that, using the theory of focalization rather than point of view. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's a particularly timely and topical question certainly for viewers who are joining us from the US at the moment.
Could I ask you to clarify, because I don't think I used the term focalization, or what's meant by that?
I think it was when you were speaking about the fact that some of the characters in your book, particularly the black characters, were underdeveloped in terms of their character, because that was the focus that the white characters in the book had on them, and how that differs necessarily from point of view, or representing point of view.
Right. If you want to speak from inside a character, you really have to go inside that character. I mean, you have to kind of get a feel, for want of a better word, of how their psyche works, what their emotions are. Even if you're not kind of conveying all of that, you sort of have to have the texture of it in the way that an actor has a sense of a character in order to kind of lightly play it. I avoided that with the black characters here. I wanted to leave them in a certain sense mysterious, the same way that Amor is mysterious. And to do that, I just went a little way. So you will see one black character, for example, sitting praying to God, and you will hear the prayer that she sends up. But it doesn't go beyond that into where the prayer comes from, or what it's rooted in. Another character who's kind of looking at himself in a mirror and admiring himself. Okay, we go that far, but you're not going to go beyond that into, I don't know, his vanity or his self-regard in the way that you might do with a white character. And the effect, or at least what I hope the effect would be, is that it keeps the spotlight on this family, or indeed on various arbitrary white characters that pass through, but that you begin to feel cumulatively that they're areas you're not going into. You're not going into certain psyches. You're not registering except to see them sort of passing in the background or performing, manual labor of one sort or another, but you're not really getting to grips with them. I hope in the sort of final scene of the book, which is, I wouldn't want to give it away, but it's a conversation that I hope sort of is a resolution to the unfulfilled promise at the heart of the book between Amor, who is no longer a little girl, she's a middle-aged woman, and Salome, this black lady who has been waiting many years for the house that she was promised. In this extended conversation in which her son, now a very angry and militant middle-aged man, jumps in, that some voice is given to the other side of this. And the fact that it's been silenced for so long means that the voice comes through with a great deal of anger. Somebody said that Lucas's voice at the end sounds like the voice of the future, and I hope that has carried through.
A rather potentially complex question on craft for both of you. How do you maintain a balance between narrative lightness and even humor in both of your most recent books, and the heaviness of the subject matter? Both The Promise and What Happens at Night are both infused with tragedy. Yeah, there's great emotion, great complexity there. Yet the writing is beautiful. The writing has a lightness, for want of a better word, readability to it, and at times also humor. How do you strike that balance?
Peter, do you want to answer that?
Sure. I guess I've always been aware as a writer, perhaps because I've always been drawn to to darkness and to unhappiness, that you can't, bring a reader on a journey that's unremittingly dark and painful and depressing. And so I'm always, I always try really hard to look for humor and keep humor in my books. And I think as Damon said, starting out, when he realized his book was going to be centered around 4 funerals, that even in these subjects that we think of as perhaps humorless, it's all about observing human behavior. And, there's humor everywhere. And I just feel like the more closely you observe people, the odder and funnier they are. And I guess the other thing I try and do is I use dialogue, a lot in my fiction, because I feel like how people say, what they don't say, and how they misspeak or lie to one another adds, humor to a book. And so a lot of times instead of as the author trying to make things funny, I try and let the characters do that.
Shall I add something to that? I don't need to. It was a perfectly full answer.
I think this was a perfectly full event right now. And so apart from mentioning, I do want to thank Lambda for partnering with us on this event. A very worthwhile, very worthy organization. And there are a couple of links to Lambda. If you don't know Lambda Literary already, you should click on one of those links in the chat and find out a bit more about this organization, and do what you can to support it as well. And thank you both very much. You've both written extraordinary books, and this is really a remarkable event to have the two of you here in conversation. So I'm grateful to both of you, Peter Cameron, whose most recent book, What Happens at Night, and Damon Galgut. Thank you for entrusting us with The Promise and for joining us at this event. And thank you again to all of you for being here.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you, Peter. I enjoyed that.
I had a pleasure. Thank you, Damon, and thank you, Michael. It was a great event. Thank you.